Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, walls that fell by faith marshes, trumpets, and a God who keeps his promises. The sun beat down on the plains of Canaan as the people of Israel stood before their first great challenge, Jericho. The city loomed before them, fortified, intimidating, its thick walls rising like a fortress of defiance. Behind those walls, Jericho's warriors waited, confident in their defenses. Israel, for all their numbers, had no battering rams, no siege engines, no ladders. They were wanderers fresh out of the wilderness. But they had something greater, the promise of God. God's strange strategy, the Lord spoke to Joshua, Moses' successor, with instructions that defied human logic. See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. Joshua 6-2. Then came the plan. For 6 days, the army was to march once around the city, silently, following the Ark of the Covenant carried by priests. 7 priests would walk before it, blowing on ram's horns. On the 7th day, they would circle the city 7 times. Then the priests would sound a long blast, and all the people would shout. The walls would collapse, and the city would be theirs. No swords raised, no siege weapons employed, just faithful obedience to God's word, the march of faith, and so they marched. Day after day, Israel rose with the dawn, lined up in formation, and circled Jericho once in silence. The only sounds were the measured footsteps of thousands and the eerie echo of ram's horns. Inside Jericho, fear mounted. The people of the city watched from the walls, bewildered by this strange ritual. On the 7th day, the air was charged with expectation. This time, Israel marched not once, but 7 times around the city. At the end of the 7th lap, Joshua gave the command, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The priests blew their horns, and the people lifted their voices in a thunderous cry. The walls fall flat, then it happened. The massive walls of Jericho, symbols of human strength and security, collapsed in an instant. Dust filled the air. Stones tumbled. The city that seemed impregnable crumbled at the sound of faith-filled obedience. Israel surged forward, taking the city just as God had promised. Only Rahab, the woman who had sheltered the spies, and her family were spared in fulfillment of the oath sworn to her. Themes woven through Jericho's fall won. Faith, the people had no power to topple Jericho's walls on their own. They had to trust God's word, even when his plan made no earthly sense. True faith is not passive, it moves forward, even when the path seems strange. 2. Obedience. Israel's victory depended on complete obedience. If they had altered the plan shouting on the first day, or refusing to march at all, the walls would have stood. Obedience, step by step, unlocked the fulfillment of God's promise. 3. God's faithfulness. From Egypt to the Jordan River, God had been leading his people. Jericho's fall was another proof. God keeps his promises. The land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now being placed into the hands of their descendants. Conclusion. When walls come down, the story of Jericho is not just about a city conquered. It is about a God who brings down walls that seem unshakable. For Israel, those walls represented the first barrier to the promised land. For us, they symbolize every obstacle that cannot be overcome by human strength, but must fall by God's power. Faith marches, obedience follows, and God, in his faithfulness, makes the impossible crumble. The lesson of Jericho still echoes today. The walls fall, not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. Gideon's call and victory, strength made perfect in weakness. From fearful farmer to reluctant warrior, the land of Israel groaned under oppression. For 7 years, the Midianites swept through like a devouring swarm of locusts raiding villages, stealing crops, driving Israel into caves and hiding places. Hunger and despair hung over the nation. Once again, they cried out to the Lord for deliverance. And God answered not with a mighty warrior already seasoned for battle, but with a fearful farmer named Gideon. The call of Gideon. Gideon was threshing wheat in secret, hiding from the Midianites, when the angel of the Lord appeared and greeted him with words that seemed absurd. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Judges 6:12. Gideon looked around, unsure. How could he be a mighty warrior when he was hiding in fear? He protested, reminding the angel of his weakness. His clan was the weakest in Manasseh. He was the least in his father's house. But God's response cut through Gideon's insecurity. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The strength Gideon needed did not come from himself, but from the God who called him. Signs of assurance. Still uncertain, Gideon asked for signs first with an offering consumed by fire. Then with the famous fleece tests, dew on the fleece but dry ground one night, then the reverse the next. Patiently, God granted Gideon reassurance. This was no ordinary call. God was shaping a leader who would learn to rely not on his own power but on the Lord. The army reduced. When Gideon finally gathered his forces, 32,000 men assembled to fight Midian's massive army. But God had a different strategy. "Too many soldiers," he said. If Israel won with such numbers, they would boast in their own strength. First, Gideon sent home the fearful, leaving 10,000. Then, God tested them by how they drank water. Those who lapped with their hands were chosen. In the end, Gideon was left with only 300 men. Against a countless host, this was humanly impossible. But that was the point. Victory would come by God's hand alone. The battle in the night. At night, Gideon and his 300 surrounded the Midianite camp. Each man carried a torch hidden inside a clay jar, along with a trumpet. At Gideon's signal, they smashed the jars, lifted the blazing torches high, and blew the trumpets. Their battle cry rang out across the valley, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Panic seized the Midianites. Confused in the chaos, they turned their swords on each other and fled. Israel pursued, and the oppressors were defeated not by might, but by God's intervention. Themes woven through Gideon's story. 1. Trust. Gideon began as a man full of fear and doubt, yet God patiently taught him to trust. True courage comes not from self-confidence, but from reliance on God's presence and promises. 2. God's strength and weakness. The reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 was no accident. It was divine design. God deliberately chose weakness to display his strength, so Israel would know their salvation came from him alone. Conclusion: the God who works through the least. Gideon's story is one of transformation. A reluctant farmer became a victorious leader, not because of his strength, but because of God's. The lesson endures. God delights to use the weak, the hesitant, the overlooked to accomplish his purposes. When walls of fear surround us or enemies seem overwhelming, his word still speaks. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And when we walk in trust, we discover what Gideon learned, that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Samson's life and fall, strength, weakness, and the God who redeems. A Nazirite judge with a turbulent heart. The days of the judges were dark in Israel's history. The people stumbled in cycles of rebellion, oppression, and deliverance. Yet in this cycle arose one of the most famous and paradoxical figures, Samson, a man of extraordinary strength and extraordinary weakness, a child of promise. Samson's story began before his birth. An angel of the Lord appeared to a barren woman, promising her a son who would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. This child was to be set apart as a Nazirite from birth, dedicated to God by strict vows. No wine or strong drink, no touching dead bodies, no cutting his hair. Samson was born not merely as a child of hope, but as an instrument of God's purpose. The rise of a strong judge. From his youth, the Spirit of the Lord stirred in Samson, giving him strength unlike any other. His feats became legendary, tearing apart a lion with his bare hands, striking down 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, carrying the gates of Gaza on his shoulders, hauling them to a hill far away. Samson embodied the power of God at work in a human vessel. Yet alongside his physical strength lay a spiritual and moral fragility, the snare of weakness. Samson's weakness was not in muscle but in desire. Time and again, he was led astray by relationships with Philistine women, disregarding God's call to remain set apart. His most infamous downfall came through Delilah, who pressed him relentlessly to reveal the secret of his strength. At last, weary of her persistence, Samson confessed, "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me." Judges 16:17. Delilah betrayed him to the Philistines. His hair was cut, his strength vanished, and he was seized blinded, shackled, and forced to grind grain in prison. The mighty judge of Israel was reduced to humiliation, the God who redeems. But Samson's story did not end in disgrace. In the prison, his hair began to grow again, a quiet sign that God was not finished with him. Brought out to entertain the Philistines in the temple of their god Dagon, Samson prayed one final prayer: "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." Judges 16:28. With renewed strength, he grasped the pillars of the temple and pulled them down, collapsing the building on himself and his enemies. In his death, Samson struck a greater blow against the Philistines than he had in his life. Themes in Samson's story. 1. God's purpose. From before his birth, Samson was chosen to begin Israel's deliverance. Despite his flaws, God's purpose stood firm. His plans are not thwarted by human weakness. 2. Human weakness. Samson's life highlights the peril of unchecked desire and pride. Though gifted with great strength, his failure to live faithfully to his calling brought him low. 3. Redemption. Even at his lowest, Samson turned back to God. His final act of faith shows that redemption is possible, and God can bring victory even through broken vessels. Conclusion. The paradox of strength and weakness. Samson's life is a tapestry of contradiction, great feats and great failures, divine power and human frailty. He reminds us that true strength does not lie in physical might or human ability, but in dependence on God. In the end, Samson's story is less about a man who failed, and more about a God who remained faithful, working through weakness, redeeming brokenness, and fulfilling his purposes in ways that surpass human understanding.